Thanks, Emily. So, can everybody hear me? I was in Soweto last month in South Africa, spending time with some pretty amazing, pretty radical youth activist leaders there. Now you can hear me even better. In Soweto, I was spending time with these youth activist leaders and over dinner, sitting down with them, and one particular young girl was just incredible. And I looked across to her one moment over dinner, and I said to her, "What is it that keeps you going? You know, what is it that lights your fire?" And she looked at me with definitely so much fire in her eyes. And she said simply, Ubuntu, which some people are nodding their heads. There's no English word for Ubuntu. It's an African concept that essentially means a person is a person through other people. A person is a person through other people. That human connection brings human empathy, which is the fuel for human equality. I first experienced a sense of human connection on a profound scale when I was very young. Every summer me and my family used to go over and spend time on my mother's rice paddy in the Philippines, where my family's from, and I discovered a few things from an early age. One was that I had an aptitude for climbing up very skinny, tall coconut trees. Unfortunately, I found I did not have a talent for climbing down them, which I only discovered, as you can imagine, at an inconvenient point. I also discovered from a very young age that the world is not fair. And I had a moment that was not at all unusual, an encounter that was not at all uncommon, where I found myself one day, at about maybe 9 years old, one summer, face to face with a little girl. She was just like me. She looked just like me, same age as me. But I had a realization that we were worlds apart, that she and I were different, that I, through no deserving of my own, had been born into Australia, into the lucky country, and that she, through no deserving of her own, had been born into extreme poverty, that where I had been given opportunity, she had been given obstacles, that where I had been given education, she had been given limitation. And so that realization of that we were all human, but that the world was not fair, was something that dawned upon me from a very early age. And I realized that the world is like, this is a very strong thought to have as a little kid, but I realized the world is like a game of Russian roulette, where by chance of where you're born can determine whether you live or die, or what kind of life you have. That our world is fundamentally unjust. And so I made a commitment. I made a commitment that I would dedicate my life, whatever that meant, to working to end injustice, to end inequality. And that commitment has taken me to the slums of India and Bangladesh, to the rural villages of East Timor and Nepal, to the genocide sites of Rwanda and Cambodia, and the urban settlements of Papua New Guinea and South Africa. And one particular boy I met that I'd love to tell you a story about is a boy I met in Mumbai. And I feel like I should return to the carpet. I don't know why. Return to the carpet. I met a young boy, that's not him, but he... So just a photo. The guy I met is around my age, and I was spending time with him in the slums of Mumbai. And so he was around my age. He'd spent most of his life living on the streets. And so on one day, sweltering, stuffy heat on the streets of Mumbai, we're having lunch, and I asked him if he wouldn't mind telling his story. I asked him, how did you end up on the street? And he said, well, Viv, when I was just 7 years old, I lost both my parents. I don't remember why I lost them. I don't know why they died. We were living in extreme poverty. I imagine it was a pretty simple cause of death, but I lost both my parents. And like millions of other children across Mumbai, no one else could take him in, and so he was left to fend for himself. At 7 years old, I don't know what you were doing at 7 years old. I had most things provided for me, pretty much every meal, a roof over my head. I went to school every day, and this kid was fending for himself. And I asked him, what was that like? And he said, well, Viv, it wasn't just that I didn't have food to eat and scavenge through the scraps of people's rubbish and got all sorts of sicknesses from that. He said it wasn't just that I didn't have clean water to drink and I would lap from the sewers like a little animal and get all sorts of sicknesses from that. He said it wasn't just that I didn't have education and was completely illiterate and would walk through the streets of my own home city, my own native indigenous homeland, and feel like a complete foreigner and complete alien, because every street sign, every shop sign, everything that everyone else was understanding, I had no clue what was going on. I was completely excluded. He said it wasn't, he just went through all these things. It wasn't just that I didn't have shelter, roof over my head, and when the monsoon season rains came down, I would lie on the street and be soaked to the bone. He went through all these things that we characterise extreme poverty as, a lack of food, lack of water, a lack of healthcare, a lack of this and that, and explained what that was like. But he said it was not just that. He said people would spit on me, people would kick at me, people would call me names you wouldn't believe, and worst of all, people would completely ignore me, a little kid. And he said what was worst of all was just the lack of dignity. And we're having this conversation on the street, and behind him there was a policeman and a whole lot of street kids everywhere. And the policeman saw myself, saw some of the people that I was with. I was taking a group of young Australians, and the policeman must have assumed that we were tourists, and he got out his baton and started hitting the children, saying, "Get out of the way, make way for the tourists," right in front of us. And when I, got over that and kept talking to my friend, he said, it was people treated us like that every day. People treated us worse than I imagine you would treat a dog. And he said he got to a point in his own life where he had become so dehumanized by the experience of extreme poverty that he actually, for long periods of time, would forget his own name. No one had treated him as enough of a human being. No one had said to him, "Little boy, what's your name?" as you and I would if you saw a lost kid on the street. No one had treated him as enough of a valuable person, a real human being, that he had not needed to use his name to introduce himself. No one had asked him for his name, and it became an irrelevant fact that for months and months at a time, he would forget it. I don't know how any person can get to a situation where they have been so robbed of their dignity, so robbed of their humanity and worth and value and identity, that they could actually forget their own very name. And so when we think about extreme poverty, we also think about dignity. World, what has happened to this person, that is not something that is acceptable to me. And I think I can say tonight, world, we're better than that. But imagine a world where, and it shouldn't be that hard to imagine a world where nobody has to be dehumanized to that extent. Imagine a world where, in fact, extreme poverty could be ended. That's what I want to talk about tonight. And you guys have actually been sitting for a little while as we've gotten started, so I'm actually going to take a bit of a risk and ask you all to stand. So I've told a bit of a story there where extreme poverty cuts to the heart of our very, very humanity. And I don't want tonight at all, I realise I'm short, you probably can't see me, that's fine. Close your eyes and listen. I don't want tonight to be just about some cool stories, some cool talks that stimulate your mind for an evening, that might inspire you and then you go home. I want tonight to be about all of us. And I want tonight to not be about the individuals that we hear stories about, but every single person in this room. All of us come into this. And it was in fact the very leaders of our entire world, of every government in the world, that came together for the first time in history and made a global promise and said, like I said tonight, world, we're better than that. World, we are better than that. We can end extreme poverty. And they said in the Millennium Declaration, as one globe, for the first time in history, they said, we will spare no effort to free our fellow men, women, and children from the abject and dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty to which more than 1 billion of them have been subjected. I don't know if you agree with that, but if you do, I'm going to ask you that after the count of 3, again, I'm taking a risk, clap with me. Just one clap, it's a power clap. 1, 2, 3. Again, 1, 2, 3. Again, 1, 2, 3. You can sit. So upon this global promise, a movement was founded. I've been lucky from a very young age to have the opportunity to be part of a movement that has stood upon that promise, that we will spare absolutely no effort to free our fellow men, women, and children from the abject and dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty to which more than 1 billion of them are subjected. And so a movement was born. When I was in school, in a school dress, I had the opportunity to be part of the Make Poverty History movement, which began when I was 16, and was part of a team of young people at the Oaktree Foundation, which is now the organisation that I lead, Australia's largest youth-run organisation, that a group of young people, a motley group of teenagers who had absolutely no experience, said it is not acceptable to live in a world where extreme poverty is okay. World, we're better than that. And they wanted to get the message out. And what better way to get the message out than the language of us all, music. And so that we had the idea to run a concert. My friend Dan had the idea to run a concert, and so we joined together, and what started out as a little battle of the bands kind of youthy, teenagery student gig grew and grew and grew, and snowballed and snowballed. In the very concept behind the idea of Oaktree, which is that from little things, big things can grow. From a tiny acorn, whether that be a tiny idea, a tiny motley crew of teenagers, can grow something big. And it grew until it became the largest ever youth-run concert in Australian history, with Bono there from U2 and Pearl Jam and John Butler Trio and Jed and Paul Kelly and Sarah Blasco and Evermore, and all these artists that joined together overwhelmingly, and media that reached more than 20 million people worldwide. And we were pretty taken aback, as you can imagine. That was the night before the G20. Next year, Australia is president again of the G20, the most powerful global gathering of world governments, they say, more so than the G8. And that movement that was sparked through the concert, we decided to take that to the road. So the year I finished school, when I was 18, volunteered full-time for Oaktree and ran a road trip, take this movement on the road. And we selected and trained up 700 young people from all across the country, trained them up to be advocates, public speakers, in skills in team management, all about causes of international aid and development. And they hit the road across the country. I'm sure there's a couple of them in the room tonight. And spoke to more than 50,000 people face-to-face, 30,000 of which signed our petition, and then gathered here at the Sydney Opera House, where we projected onto the sails of the Sydney Opera House. We actually had one of the world's largest data projectors. It was like 3 by 3 metres, just the projector, and projected from one side of Sydney Harbour onto the sails of the Sydney Opera House like a screen. We had to design the artwork of that to be contoured to fit to the sails. It was pretty cool. And that was broadcast globally by BBC and CNN to a global audience. And it was at that event that a political leader, who is now our Prime Minister, committed to lift Australia's commitment to ending global poverty by the largest ever increase in Australia's aid in Australian history, and that's become a bipartisan promise that we've had to hold them accountable to. But that promise and that commitment, that policy change, again, sparked by a bunch of motley teenagers, that policy commitment announced that night resulted over years to come in billions and billions and billions, in fact, of dollars that meant healthcare for the first time for millions of people, meant education for the first time for millions of people. Last year alone, Australia assisted more than 10 million people in disaster relief situations, put more than 500,000 children in school and saved 200,000 lives, amongst many other things, and that was just last year. So, I don't know about you, but when you think about some of the biggest challenges that our world faces and are daunted by those, that's okay. But don't let it stop you from taking action. I want to talk a bit about some of the actions that has resulted in. I want to talk actually a bit about the value of an amplified impact. When we do advocacy for a much bigger cause, sometimes people ask, why are you wasting your time? Why don't you just focus on raising money and rattling a tin and sending that money directly to a project that's effective and leave it at that? Why should you be focusing on decision makers? Surely you're wasting your time. And you know what? Most of the time, you probably are. But if you win even one policy change in an entire lifetime of campaigning, I strongly believe in the power of campaigning. If you win even one policy change, you will have an amplified impact far beyond what you alone could do directly. I could never, and nor could all the people I know, never single-handedly, through our direct work, fundraise $4 billion. We could try. We could get probably pretty close. We'd get into the millions, but I don't think we could raise $4 billion. But one little policy change, which is something that's within the realm of a decision maker, has an amplified impact far beyond what we could do alone. And that's only 37 cents in every $100 from the Australian government. It's only 37 cents in every $100. That's less than Australians spend on pets. Which is something to put in context, for sure. The impact of Australian aid, as I outlined, is something to be proud of, and something that's far beyond what we could do alone, and something to keep improving and keep pushing more for. The good news when it comes to ending extreme poverty, you might hear quite often that poverty never changes. You might hear quite often that these huge global challenges that face our world today will never change. And the good news is, it's already changing. The good news is, progress is being made. And in fact, within our lifetimes already, since in just the last 20 years, we've already seen the world has already halved extreme poverty. We set a very ambitious goal when the world stood up for the first time in history and said that declaration that I told you. They set a goal to halve extreme poverty by the year 2015. It was an audacious, outrageous goal that people scoffed at. And they achieved it 5 years early, in 2010. Next time someone says to you, these things will never change, tell them that. They also halved the proportion of children dying before their 5th birthday by preventable diseases. That's 19,000 children's lives saved every single day. That's 19,000 people who have a name, who have a face, who have a personality, and who have a whole bright future ahead of them. That's also the halving of maternal deaths, of women, and particularly young women, of which pregnancy and childbirth is one of the leading causes of death in many developing countries. They've also halved the proportion of women that die in childbirth and pregnancy. That's good news. There's people with faces, there's people with names, there's people with personalities, there's people with a bright future ahead of them. And it's something to celebrate. And it's something to tell. It's you know, TED is meant to be about ideas worth spreading. I think that's something worth spreading. So where to next? Let me just start that again. Where to next for the movement? Nelson Mandela, when he was launching the Make Poverty History movement, had a famous quote where he said, sometimes it falls on a generation to be great. You can be that great generation. When I was over in South Africa last month, you know, people were pretty sad about Mandela's health, but also very reflective on where they'd come, coming out of apartheid. And those words that sometimes in history it falls on a generation to be great. It falls on a generation to tackle some great injustice, some great inequality, some great situation of oppression or unfairness. And what Mandela was saying is the next big challenge for this generation is extreme poverty. But we've already halved it in the last 20 years, and we can end extreme poverty in our lifetime. Imagine being grandparents or, you know, being wherever you might be later in life and speaking to the next generation, speaking to the little kids and saying, and just reflecting and saying, yeah, I remember when more than 1 billion people lived in the most abject and dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty, and yet we had the resources to end it. I remember, and they will say, how could that be? In the way that we say, how could we have lived in a world that had apartheid? How could we live in a world where, you know, all the greatest injustices and oppressions occurred? And we'll tell them, we saw it end. We'll tell them, I was there. You might even tell them you were part of the movement that helped achieve it. And the great news, I've told you some of the good news, but the great news is that, in fact, you might have seen that a United Nations report has actually announced this year that if we keep going at this rate, we will in fact potentially see the end of extreme poverty by 2030. Not just within our lifetime, it's not a pipe dream, but it's in fact so within reach that it could be 2030. Isn't that amazing? I ain't gonna be no grandma in 2030. But coming back to the kid I told you about in Mumbai, he has a name. His name is Vijay. Say it. Vijay. He has a name, and his name won't be forgotten. And his name is something that I won't forget, and his name is something that he won't forget ever again. Vijay, the reason why I was meeting with him was because we had just been meeting with Indian government ministers, we'd just been meeting with UN senior officials, we'd just been meeting with all these diplomats and all these people, and we'd asked them who should we meet with at the local level in Mumbai, and every single person has said, meet with this leader of this amazing organisation. It's a pioneering organisation, it's an award-winning initiative from these incredible young people in Mumbai that are running amazing programs for people living on the street. It's unique because it's run entirely by people who they themselves live on the street. I was meeting with him because he was this renowned leader. And as he had finished telling his story of that abject and dehumanizing condition that he went through and how he forgot his own name, he after that said, now let me introduce you to my staff. And with great dignity and with great standing and just pride, he called out into the street, and all these people that were lying on mats and lying on street corners and begging and all across the street, they all got up and they all gathered around, and they were his staff. And he said, let me introduce you to my staff. And he stood before them like a president and addressed them and said, our comrades here from Australia, a delegation, have come to join with us in our common cause, and spoke with such conviction and such passion, and he was so much more articulate than I could ever hope to be, so much more passionate than I could hope to be. He was literally Obama-style presidential address to these motley crew of street people in Mumbai, and I had to stand back and say, man, if this guy, if Vijay, can come from such circumstances, such abject and dehumanizing circumstances that he has risen out of, if he can come from that and be this amazing young leader that he is today, making the incredible impact that he is today, I just had to be so convicted by that and say, how much more so should people who do actually have opportunities at your fingertips, resources at your fingertips, a chance to influence, how much more so should you be taking hold of that? Should I be taking hold of that to make an impact in the world? Martin Luther King had a quote where he said, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar." He said, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that a system which produces beggars needs restructuring." That's a pretty big nut to crack. A system that produces beggars needs restructuring. Well, systems are hard nuts to crack. It's easier to bandage the wounds of one person who's been hurt by injustice than it is to actually tackle inequality itself. So now the real work begins. First, I've spoken about policy change. We need to hold our decision makers accountable to the policies that will actually right some of the inequalities and address some of the social challenges that we face. Australia needs to keep accountable to its promise that it made on the international stage to give just 70 cents in every $100. It's affordable. The UK and other countries are already doing it, despite their economy being so far behind ours. We need transparency to prevent corruption. We need governments and companies alike to act responsibly. In fact, more money is robbed from the developing world in unpaid corporate taxes than is given to the developing world in international aid. We need policies for fair trade, land rights, education. As Nelson Mandela once said, education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world, and that's why, I guess, for Oaktree, we call for policy change, but we also make direct change in the power of education. In some of the poorest communities in East Timor, Papua New Guinea and Cambodia and beyond, we've been able to now enable more than 120,000 people to break the poverty cycle through the power of education, through the power of young people using education to lift themselves and their families and their communities out of poverty. And thirdly, social change. It says 2. It should say 3. In case you were wondering. And thirdly, social change. You know, we actually want to build a generation-wide movement of people, of ordinary people, of a society of people that actually stand up and say, world, we can be better. And say, like all the great historical social movements that have ended apartheid or changed, you know, the British and transatlantic slave trade or civil rights in the US, you name it, we say the social movement that will define our generation is to end extreme poverty in our lifetime. So are you in? That's the question. That's the question I started with. I don't want tonight to be a bright idea, but a question to you and a challenge. Are you in? Not whether it's possible, theoretically, to make poverty history, but whether you will be part of writing that history. Yes, we can end extreme poverty, but we need momentum. We need every person in this room. So join us. As the writer Arundhati Roy said, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. And on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. So let's bring that new world to life.